Today, on July 4th, 2026, we celebrate the 250th birthday of the United States, honoring a 2.5 century legacy of independence, resilience, and progress. Here is a tribute you can use to mark this historic semi-quincentennial milestone. That's a big word. Don't trip over it if you try and say it. Semi-quincentennial. 250 years ago, a group of visionaries decided to reject the established maps of their time and chart a completely new course for human governance. They built a nation founded on the radical idea of liberty, proving that a government could be steered by its own people rather than a distant monarch. This revolutionary spirit continues to act as the compass guiding the nation through its greatest challenges. Now, America has historically served as a safe harbor for those who think outside the box and attempt to achieve the impossible. The nation's growth was fueled by brilliant, unconventional minds like Nikola Tesla, who immigrated to the United States and completely revolutionized how humanity harnesses electricity. This relentless drive to push boundaries, embrace neurodivergent thinkers, and invent the future remains the core pillar of the American identity. Over the past 2.5 centuries, the country has faced massive challenges, ranging from deep internal divisions to complex global conflicts. Yet the American country, the United States of America, has continually proven its resilience, learning to repair itself and adjust its sails just to move forward towards a more perfect union. It's this unique ability to acknowledge past turbulence while continually striving for brighter, more equitable horizons that define the nation's true strength. Now, as we celebrate this historic 250th birthday, we honor not just the history that we've written, but the uncharted waters ahead. The United States remains a vast, complex vessel fueled by the diverse dreams and relentless hopes of its everyday people. The unwavering commitment to freedom. May the next chapter of the American journey be guided by unity, continued innovation, and an unwavering commitment to freedom for all. I want to talk about what some of the early patriots gave to help this nation become a reality. And they're not in any particular order of importance. I just did some stories on some of the people involved in setting up this country. So let's look at a wealthy Virginian who chose to fight. When we look at the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, it is crucial to realize they were not desperate rebels with nothing to lose. Many of them were incredibly comfortable, wealthy men who enjoyed the highest privileges of colonial society. Now let's take Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia. He was one of these men. Born into one of Virginia's most affluent first families, he inherited massive estates, tens of thousands of pounds in bonds, and a life entirely unencumbered by debt. He could have easily stayed quiet, protected his fortune, and let the revolution happen without him. But instead, he willingly chose to put everything on the line for the promise of liberty. Nelson didn't just sign the Declaration of Independence, he practically bankrolled the revolution in his home state. As the war escalated, he realized that the Continental Army desperately needed supplies and manpower. He used his massive personal fortune. He raised, he outfitted, and he trained his own cavalry unit. When the state desperately needed more funds, Nelson went to other wealthy plantation owners for loans. Because the colonial government was highly unstable and the outcome of the war was uncertain, these men refused to lend money to the state. So Nelson stepped in and personally guaranteed the loans, essentially backing the revolution with his own net worth. The most legendary demonstration of Nelson's sacrifice happened during the siege of Yorktown in 1781. At this point, Nelson was serving not only as the commander of the Virginia militia, but also as the governor of Virginia. The British Army, commanded by Lord Cornwallis, had completely occupied Nelson's hometown. Now, during an artillery bombardment, the American and French forces noticed a massive, beautiful brick mansion in the center of town. General Lafayette reportedly asked Nelson whose home it was. Nelson knew Cornwallis was likely using the house, his own family estate, as the British headquarters. Without hesitation, Nelson ordered the artillery to open fire on his own home. And according to legend, he even offered a reward to the first American gunner who could hit it. Well, today, if you visit the Nelson House in Yorktown, you can still see the cannonballs embedded in the brickwork. It's a permanent physical scar of a leader willing to destroy his own legacy in order to win the war. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the Revolutionary War, but it also ended Thomas Nelson's comfortable life. The demands of his service had completely ruined his health and his business. Furthermore, the newly formed government, struggling to survive financially, never repaid the massive loans he had personally guaranteed, and his creditors came knocking. Nelson was forced to sell off the remainder of his once massive estate to pay the debts that he took on for his country. Just 8 years after the siege, at the age of 50, the man who was once the wealthiest person in Virginia died practically in poverty. To protect his body from being seized by his remaining creditors as collateral, he was buried in an unmarked grave. Before his death, when asked if he was embittered by losing his entire fortune, Nelson reportedly replied that he would do it all over again. He gave his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, ensuring that the United States of America could become a reality. Now let's talk about Carter Braxton. When we think of the founding fathers, we often picture radical revolutionaries eager to tear down the British system. Well, Carter Braxton of Virginia was not one of those men. Born into extraordinary wealth as the grandson of a prominent planter, Braxton was a cautious, conservative man with deep ties to the British establishment. He inherited a massive estate, 12,000 acres of land, and a lucrative international shipping business. His own father in law was the king's receiver, holding the royal purse strings in Virginia. When the first rumblings of the revolution began, Braxton desperately wanted to avoid bloodshed. He believed that peace could still be negotiated. In fact, just days after the battles of Lexington and Concord, when a furious Patrick Henry threatened to march an armed militia against the royal governor, it was Carter Braxton who stepped in. Using his diplomatic skills and family connections, he negotiated a peaceful settlement that paid the colonists for stolen gunpowder, single-handedly saving the city of Williamsburg from immediate devastation. When Braxton arrived at the Second Continental Congress in early 1776, he openly criticized the rush towards independence. He wrote pamphlets warning that a sudden break from Britain could lead to chaos and reckless forms of government. He was deeply suspicious of the radical ideas pushed by men like John Adams. But as the war raged on and the reality of British tyranny became undeniable, Braxton faced a profound moral crossroads. He realized that peace could no longer be bought and liberty could only be won through absolute commitment. Despite knowing exactly how much he stood to lose, this wealthy, cautious conservative stood with his peers and voted for the Declaration of Independence. He adopted a mindset of absolute dedication, in for a penny, in for a pound. Once he committed, Braxton held nothing back. The American military desperately needed funds, food, and clothing. Well, Braxton personally loaned the equivalent of tens of thousands of pounds to the Continental cause, loans that the young, struggling government would never be able to repay, not in full. Because he owned a massive fleet of merchant ships, he converted them into privateers to fight the British Navy and secure supplies for the colonial army. The British targeted him relentlessly. His ships were either sunk or captured, completely destroying his lucrative transatlantic trade. British forces also ravaged and destroyed several of his Virginia plantations. Now, Carter Braxton survived the war, continuing to serve faithfully in the Virginia state government until his death. But the financial toll of his patriotism was absolute. The man who had once been one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia, the man who could have easily maintained his fortune by staying loyal to the crown, was completely ruined by his dedication to the American cause. By the end of his life, He was forced to sell off his vast estates to satisfy the debts that he had taken on. He spent his final days living in a small rented row house in Richmond, where he died following a series of strokes at the age of 61. Now, Carter Braxton's story is a powerful reminder that the American Revolution was not just fought by hot blooded radicals, it was fought by cautious, comfortable men who studied the immense cost of freedom, looked at their fortunes and their families, and decided that the birth of this nation was worth sacrificing everything they had. When we talk about the founding of this nation, we often think of fiery young intellectuals shouting in taverns. But the revolution was also carried by quiet older men who had spent their entire lives building a peaceful existence. John Hart of New Jersey was one of these men. Known throughout his community as Honest John, he was a prosperous farmer, a respected judge, and a devoted family man. He was born around 1713, and he had spent decades working the soil of his massive estate in Hopewell, New Jersey. Together with his beloved wife, Deborah, he raised 13 children, and by 1776, John Hart was in his mid 60s. He had everything a man of his era could want. He had a thriving farm, a large, loving family, a deep respect for his neighbors, and the comfortable twilight of a successful life ahead of him. He had absolutely no reason to seek out a war. But when the call came, John Hart looked at the comfortable life he had built, and he decided that living under tyranny was too high a price to pay for that peace. In June 1776, at an age when most men would simply stay home, John Hart rode to Philadelphia. He took his seat in the Second Continental Congress as a delegate from New Jersey. And when the moment arrived, Honest John stepped forward and became the 13th man to sign the Declaration of Independence. When he put his pen to that parchment, he was fully aware that the final line on the document, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." For John Hart, those words were not a philosophical flourish. They were a devastating prophecy. Almost immediately after signing the Declaration, the reality of war crashed down on his family. In the late fall of 1776, Hart received word that his wife Deborah had fallen gravely ill. He rushed home from Congress to be by her side. But the British Army was advancing rapidly through New Jersey, and John Hart, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and Speaker of the New Jersey Assembly, was a highly prized target. British and Hessian troops marched towards Hopewell. As his wife lay dying, the enemy besieged his farm. Hart refused to leave her side. Only after she passed away on October 8th did he finally flee, forced into the freezing wilderness just ahead of the British troops. Now, at the age of 65, having just buried his wife, John Hart became a hunted fugitive in the very land that he was trying to free. The British and the Hessian soldiers ransacked his massive estate. They damaged his property and destroyed his livelihood. His 13 children were forced to scatter in every direction just to survive the invasion. For weeks, as the brutal winter of 1776 set in, Honest John survived by sleeping in caves and rock outcroppings in the rugged South Sourland Mountains. He endured freezing temperatures, hunted like an animal, entirely separated from his family and the comfortable life that he had built. When George Washington miraculously crossed the Delaware and turned the tide of the Battle of Trenton in late December 1776, the British were finally pushed back. John Hart was able to emerge from the mountains and return to Hopewell. But the life he knew, it was gone. His wife was dead, his farm was damaged, and his children were scattered across the countryside. His fortune was effectively ruined by the deprecation of colonial money and the debts that he had taken on. Yet, astonishingly, his spirit remained unbroken. He immediately returned to public service, resuming his duties as Speaker of the Assembly. In the summer of 1778, when General George Washington desperately needed a place to rest his weary army before the massive Battle of Monmouth, John Hart opened his damaged farm, and for days, Washington and 12,000 Continental troops camped in Hart's Fields, drinking from his spring as they prepared for victory. John Hart did not live to see the freedom he had sacrificed everything for. The physical toll of hiding in the freezing mountains and the emotional devastation of losing his family, it broke his health. In May 1779, at the age of 66, he passed away from kidney stones, having given everything he had to the American cause. Today, as we celebrate 250 years of independence, we must remember that men like John Hart, that he was not a soldier who died on a battlefield. He was a grandfather, a farmer, and a husband who believed so deeply in the promise of liberty that he was willing to lose his wife, his children, his home, and his life just so we could live in freedom. The story of a man whose name is practically synonymous with the Declaration of Independence doesn't begin with a rebellion. It begins with the sudden acquisition of unimaginable wealth. Born in 1737 in Braintree, Massachusetts, the boy was the son of a modest clergyman, but his life took a massive permanent detour when his father died. At the age of 7, he was sent to live with his uncle, Thomas Hancock, a childless merchant who happened to be one of the richest men in Boston. Young John was pulled from his modest life and thrust into the highest tiers of the colonial aristocracy. He attended the elite Boston Latin School, graduated from Harvard College at just 17, and learned the intricacies of his uncle's vast transatlantic shipping empire. When his uncle died in 1764, the 27-year-old John inherited everything: the massive fleet of merchant ships, the lucrative trade routes, the enormous fortune, and the grand mansion perched atop Beacon Hill. Practically overnight, he became the wealthiest man in New England. With his massive fortune, John Hancock could have easily aligned himself with the British crown and lived a life of uninterrupted luxury. But as the British Parliament began passing acts to heavily tax colonial trade, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, Hancock felt his livelihood and the livelihoods of his fellow Bostonians were being unfairly choked. He began associating with a scrappy, fiery radical by the name of Samuel Adams. They were an odd pair. Adams was a brilliant but practically penniless agitator, while Hancock was the perfectly manicured, wealthy aristocrat. But Adams needed Hancock's immense wealth to fund his resistance, and Hancock needed Adams' political genius. Hancock began actively defying the crown. When the British cracked down on colonial shipping, Hancock simply smuggled his goods. In 1768, British customs officials seized his merchant sloop, the Liberty, accusing him of smuggling Madeira wine without paying the taxes. And instead of quietly paying the fines, Hancock fought back, and a massive riot broke out in Boston. The British were forced to call in the military troops to quell the unrest. With the seizure of his ship, the wealthy aristocrat was suddenly elevated into a visible martyr for the patriot cause. By 1774, Hancock's popularity in Massachusetts was absolute. He was elected president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, essentially acting as the leader of the colony's shadow government after the British disbanded the official legislature. This made him a direct enemy of the crown. King George III and his royal governors decided that the rebellion could be crushed if they simply cut the head off the snake. The British explicitly ordered the arrest of John Hancock and Samuel Adams for high treason. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Hancock and Adams were hiding in a parsonage in Lexington, Massachusetts. They were woken in the middle of the night by a frantic rider named Paul Revere, who warned them that the British army was marching directly towards them. Hancock, showing his typical aristocratic stubbornness, initially grabbed his sword and musket, fully intending to fight the British army by himself. Adams had to convince him that their role was to lead the government, not to die on a village green. They fled into the darkness just hours before the shot heard around the world was fired at Lexington, sparking the Revolutionary War. Hancock made his way to Philadelphia to join the Second Continental Congress, Because of his immense popularity, his wealth, and the fact that he was actively being hunted by the British Army, the delegates unanimously elected him as president of the Congress in May of 1775. For the next year, Hancock, presiding over a grueling, often bitter debates regarding independence, and then on the sweltering day of July 4th, 1776, the Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. As the president of the Congress, it was Hancock's job to sign the document first to authenticate it. What he did next was created an American legend. According to the famous legend, Hancock stepped up to the parchment and signed his name in a massive, bold cursive, loudly declaring, "There, John Bull can read my name without spectacles. He may double his reward for my head." The truth of the matter is slightly less theatrical, but no less profound. When the official parchment was ready to be signed in 1776, Hancock was the very first person to put ink to page. There were no lines drawn on the document. There was simply just a big blank space beneath the text. And as president of the Congress, he naturally signed his name front and center. Historians have analyzed his handwriting from various other letters and ledgers, and they discovered that Hancock always signed his name that large. It was simply his normal signature, bold, flamboyant, and heavily ornamented, perfectly matching his wealthy aristocratic personality. When the other 55 delegates eventually came up to sign beneath him, they simply chose to write their names in a much smaller space to ensure everyone could fit their name on the page. But while he may not have been intentionally trying to taunt King George III with the size of the letters, the danger he placed on himself was incredibly real. The British Crown had already placed a bounty on his head. By signing that document first, John Hancock was permanently tying his massive fortune and his very life to an untried, desperate rebellion. Hancock would go on to serve as the first governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a position he held for almost the rest of his life until his death in 1793. He sacrificed much of his vast fortune, choosing the perilous path of a revolutionary over the safe life of a loyalist merchant. Now, today, his name is the very first thing you see when you look at the Declaration of Independence. The man who inherited an empire and gave it all up to help build a nation, ensuring that for the rest of American history, the phrase, "put your John Hancock right here," would be synonymous with absolute, unwavering commitment. To truly understand the drama of the Declaration of Independence, you have to understand the mechanics of the vote. The Continental Congress did not vote by individual delegates, they voted by colony. To present a united front to the world, the resolution for independence needed to pass unanimously among the colonies that were participating. On July 1st, 1776, Congress in Philadelphia was deadlocked over Virginian Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. In the Delaware's delegation, there were two men present, Thomas McKean, who passionately favored independence, and George Read, who believed that it was too soon and voted against it. Because the two delegates were split, Delaware's vote was officially neutralized, throwing the massive wrench into the quest for a unanimous declaration. There was a third delegate from Delaware by the name of Caesar Rodney, but Rodney was not in Philadelphia. He was 80 miles away at his farm in Dover, Delaware. Caesar Rodney was a remarkably devoted public servant. Despite lacking any formal legal education, he had served as high sheriff, justice of the peace, and a militia captain. At this exact moment in the summer of 1776, he was functioning as a brigadier general in the state militia, trying to suppress loyalist uprisings in Sussex County. But Rodney was also fighting a much more personal battle. He suffered from severe facial cancer, often described by contemporaries as skin cancer, which caused him immense pain. Seeking treatment in London was no longer an option, as he was actively rebelling against the British Crown. He was in the late stages of this disease, completely exhausted, and warned by his doctor against strenuous activity. When Thomas McKean realized that the final deciding vote for independence would be cast in the morning of July 2nd, he knew he desperately needed Rodney to break the tie. He paid a rider to take an emergency dispatch south to Dover, pleading with Rodney to hurry to Philadelphia. The message reached Rodney at his farm on the evening of July 1st. The weather had turned incredibly violent. The massive summer thunderstorm was rolling across the eastern seaboard, turning colonial dirt roads into thick, treacherous mud. The rational man, especially one suffering from terminal facial cancer, might have looked at the raging storm, considered the 80-mile journey, and decided it was simply impossible. But Caesar Rodney did not hesitate. He ignored the warnings of his doctor. He mounted his horse and he rode straight into the storm. He rode through a torrential rain, lightning, and pitch black darkness. He did not stop to sleep. He stopped only long enough to change horses at taverns along the route, pushing himself and the animals to their absolute limit. He rode for approximately 18 hours straight. That journey that normally took a comfortable traveler at least 2 full days. Back in Philadelphia on the morning of July 2nd, the Congress was gathering at the Pennsylvania State House, now its Independence Hall. The vote was imminent. Thomas McKean stood outside the building, anxiously scanning the muddy street, utterly exhausted, soaking wet, and completely covered in mud. He didn't even take time to change his clothes. He walked directly into the floor of Congress, still wearing his riding boots and muddy spurs. When the roll call reached Delaware and the delegates looked to the exhausted, muddy man standing before them, Rodney reportedly declared, "As I believe the voice of my constituents and of all sensible and honest men is in favor of independence, and my own judgment concurs with them, I vote for independence." With that single sentence, the tie was broken. Delaware voted yes, and the Continental Congress officially adopted the resolution for independence. Now, Rodney's dramatic ride secured his place in history. He later signed that formal parchment on August 2nd, but it cost him politically and physically. The conservative faction in his home county was furious with his vote, and he was temporarily voted out of office. Instead of resting, he immediately turned to military affairs, recruiting troops for the war effort. He was eventually elected president, the equivalent of governor at the time of Delaware, serving from 1778 to 1781, where he kept the state focused on supplying the Continental Army despite his rapidly declining health. Now, Caesar Rodney died in 1784 at the age of 55, just 1 year after the Treaty of Paris formally ended the Revolutionary War. He lived just long enough to see the independent nation he had risked his life in that thunderstorm to create. Now, today, if you look closely at the back of Delaware State Quarter, you will see a man on a horseback riding into the night. It is a permanent tribute to the incredible, agonizing ride of Caesar Rodney, the man who proved that sometimes you simply have to ride directly into the storm in order to change the course of history. Now, let's talk about an emotional story of Richard Stockton, the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who was imprisoned specifically for putting his name on that document. And if you were to look at the life of Richard Stockton prior to the summer of 1776, you would never guess that he would become a revolutionary. Born into extreme wealth on an estate in Princeton, New Jersey, land his grandfather had originally purchased directly from William Penn, Stockton was a polished, highly educated, aristocratic lawyer. And for years, as tensions rose between the colonies and Great Britain, Stockton desperately tried to find a middle ground. He was deeply dreading the prospect of a bloody war. He drafted proposals suggesting that the American colonies should be given self-rule but remain entirely loyal to the British crown. He was a man of law, and he wanted to solve the conflict inside of a courtroom, not on a battlefield. But when he was elected to the Second Continental Congress in June of 1776, the time for compromise had evaporated. Stockton arrived in Philadelphia late, soaking wet from a massive thunderstorm, just in time to hear John Adams deliver a thunderous, impassioned speech advocating for total separation. As a brilliant lawyer himself, Stockton insisted on hearing both sides of the argument. After listening to the debate, he realized Adams was right. The middle ground was gone. Stockton threw his support behind the measure and became the first delegate from New Jersey to sign the Declaration of Independence. By signing his name, Richard Stockton sealed his own terrible fate. In the late fall of 1776, the Continental Army was suffering massive defeats, and the British Army began sweeping across New Jersey. Stockton realized his beloved estate in Princeton, called Morven, lay directly in the path of the advancing British forces. He desperately rushed to move his wife and children to a friend's house about 30 miles away, but they were not safe. A group of local loyalists, fully aware of who Stockton was and what he had signed, discovered their hiding place. On November 30th, 1776, the Loyalists kicked down the door in the dead of night. They dragged the aristocratic judge from his bed, clad only in his nightshirt and breeches. They marched him through the freezing winter weather and handed him directly to the British Army. While other signers of the Declaration suffered property damage and lost fortunes, Richard Stockton holds the tragic distinction, for he was the only founding father to be thrown into a British prison specifically because he signed the Declaration of Independence. The British didn't treat him as a gentleman or as an honorable prisoner of war. They treated him as a common criminal and a high traitor. He was thrown into the notorious Provost prison in New York. He was shackled in irons, intentionally starved, and left to freeze in the bitter winter cold without adequate clothing. At the time of his capture, the British commanders had issued a proclamation that any rebel who signed an oath of allegiance to King George III and promised to take no further part in the war would be pardoned. Stockton endured the horrific freezing conditions of the prison for roughly 5 agonizing weeks. Eventually, his health completely broke. Faced with starvation, freezing to death, and the complete destruction of his physical body, it's widely believed by historians that Stockton gave in and signed that British amnesty agreement to secure his release. And when he was finally released in January of 1777, following intense pressure from the Continental Congress and George Washington, he was a shattered man. He returned to Princeton only to find his beautiful estate, Morven, occupied by British General Cornwallis. His property had been pillaged, his furniture destroyed, and his extensive library burned to ashes, and his livestock stolen. He was financially ruined. More tragically, his reputation was deeply scarred. Because he had likely signed that British oath to survive a prison camp, some of his contemporaries viewed him with intense suspicion, though he later signed a new oath affirming his allegiance to the United States. Richard Stockton never recovered from the brutal treatment that he endured in the Provost prison. He lived the rest of his short life as an invalid, constantly in pain. A few years later, he developed cancer of the lip that had spread to his throat. He died in February 1781 at just 50 years old, several months before the American victory at Yorktown. When we celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we must often focus on the glory of the moment. Richard Stockton's story forces us to look at the agonizing physical reality of the final sentence of that document. He pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, and the British took almost all of it. Let's talk about Edward Rutledge, the youngest man to ever put his name on the Declaration of Independence, highlighting his journey from a hesitant youth to a captured prisoner of war. When we picture the founders debating in Independence Hall, we usually envision older, battle-hardened men in powdered wigs. But the reality is that the American Revolution was also driven by incredibly young men. In the summer of 1776, Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old. But the youngest man in the room, the man who held the fate of an entire Southern colony in his hands, was Edward Rutledge of South Carolina. He was only 26 years old. Rutledge was born in Charleston to a wealthy family, an elite family. Unlike many upper-class Southerners, he was sent across the ocean to study law at the Inns of Court in London. He returned to South Carolina, a polished, highly educated, and successful lawyer who was deeply ingrained in the colonial aristocracy. He was brilliant, but he was also young, and his youth sometimes rubbed the older delegates the wrong way. The famously grumpy John Adams once described young Rutledge in his diary as excessively vain, excessively weak, and excessively variable and unsteady. But beneath that youthful vanity was a sharp political mind. And by the time he was 24, he had been chosen to represent his state at the First Continental Congress. When the Second Continental Congress began heavily debating independence in 1776, Edward Rutledge was one of the loudest voices urging caution. He represented a wealthy plantation based economy that relied heavily on British trade. He was not opposed to colonial rights, but he believed that rushing into independence without a solid national government and strong foreign alliances was essentially just a suicide mission. Now, on July 1st, 1776, the Congress took a preliminary test vote on Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. South Carolina, led by Rutledge, voted no. That night, Rutledge faced a massive political and moral dilemma. He knew that for the declaration to have any real power against the British Empire, the vote had to be unanimous. He looked to the momentum of the other colonies and realized that independence was inevitable. If South Carolina held out, they would be fighting the British alone, or worse, fighting their fellow colonists. Putting aside his intense personal reservations, the 26-year-old stepped up to lead. He spent the night persuading the rest of South Carolina delegation to change their stance. The next morning, on July 2nd, when the official vote was cast, Rutledge delivered South Carolina's vote as a yes, securing the unanimous front for the revolution which it desperately needed. Now, like other signers, Edward Rutledge did not just put his name on a piece of paper and go home to sit out the war. He returned to South Carolina and actively joined the fight, serving as a captain of artillery in the state militia. In 1780, the reality of what he had signed caught up with him. The British Army launched a massive siege on Charleston. The city fell, and Captain Edward Rutledge, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was captured by the British. The British recognized exactly who he was, and he was taken as a high value prisoner of war and shipped down to a military prison in St. Augustine, Florida. For nearly a year, the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence was held captive and endured the harsh conditions and the constant threat of execution for treason. Rutledge was finally freed in a prisoner exchange in July of 1781. Most men would have taken their freedom and retired from public life, but Rutledge immediately went back to work. He served in the state legislature and became a vital force for helping South Carolina rebuild after a devastation of war. His reputation was so strong that President George Washington explicitly asked Rutledge to serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court. Astonishingly, Rutledge declined the offer, preferring to stay in South Carolina and serve his local people. In 1798, he was elected the 39th governor of South Carolina. Edward Rutledge never made it to old age. He passed away in January 1800 at just 50 years old while serving as governor. But in his short life, he proved that courage is not restricted to the old and the experienced. The youngest man in the room made one of the hardest decisions and suffered the brutal consequences of a prisoner of war and helped secure the birth of a nation. To understand the incredible sacrifice of Charles Carroll, you first have to understand the deep contradictions of his life. He was born in Maryland, 1737, to a massive, sprawling family fortune. By the time the American Revolution broke out, he was widely considered to be the wealthiest man in all of the 13 colonies. But despite his staggering wealth, Charles Carroll was legally a second class citizen. He was a Roman Catholic in a society dominated by the Church of England. In the colony of Maryland, Catholics were heavily discriminated against. It was illegal for a Catholic to hold public office, illegal for a Catholic to vote, and even illegal to educate Catholic children in their faith. Because of these strict laws, Carroll was sent across the ocean at age 11. He spent 17 years in Europe, receiving a brilliant classical education in legal education from the Jesuits in France and the legal scholars of London. When he returned to Maryland, At age 27, he was an incredibly educated, wildly wealthy man who had absolutely no political voice of his own, not even in his own home. When the conflict with Great Britain began to boil over, Carroll saw an opportunity not just for national independence, but for religious and civil liberty. He began writing a brilliant, fiery political essays under the pseudonym First Citizen, publicly challenging the oppressive British government and the proprietary leaders of Maryland. His writings were so powerful that the anti British factions in Maryland quickly realized they needed his brilliant legal mind, regardless of his religion. He was invited to join in the shadow government of the revolution. When it came time to declare independence, Charles Carroll had more to lose financially than anyone else in the Continental Congress. If the rebellion failed, the British government would seize his sprawling estates, his massive businesses, and his fortune to pay for the war, and he would hang as a traitor. John Adams even famously noted that Carroll was choosing to hazard his all, his immense fortune, and his life for the cause of freedom. When Carroll stepped up to sign the Declaration of Independence on August 2nd, 1776, he made sure there would be absolutely no confusion about who he was. Legend says that because there were other men named Charles Carroll living in Maryland, a bystander joked that he might escape the hangman's noose if the British arrested the wrong man. To ensure King George III knew exactly which Charles Carroll was rebelling, he proudly and deliberately signed his name as Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the name of his massive estate. It was a profound act of defiance from the wealthiest man in America, daring the British Empire to come and take his fortune. Carroll survived the war with his fortune intact and his civil liberties finally secured. The new nation he helped create abolished the religious tests that had once kept him out of politics, allowing him to serve as one of Maryland's first United States senators. He outlived nearly everyone else from the Revolutionary era. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration was adopted, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day. With their passing, Charles Carroll of Carrollton became the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. He lived for another 6 years, finally passing away in 1832 at the incredible age of 95. In his final years, looking back on the massive fortune he had risked and the liberty he gained, Carroll wrote that the Declaration of Independence was the best earthly inheritance their ancestors could bequeath to future generations. Now, moving on to the next subject, the next person that I want to hold up. Long before her name became a permanent fixture in American mythology, Betsy Ross was a woman defined by her quiet defiance. Born Elizabeth Griscom in 1752, she was the eighth of 17 children in a strict Quaker household in Philadelphia. She was educated in Quaker schools and apprenticed to a local upholsterer to learn the intricate trades of sewing and crafting. It was there, at the age of 17, that she fell in love with a fellow apprentice named John Ross. But John was an Anglican, and the Quaker community strictly forbade marrying outside the faith. Knowing exactly what the consequences would be, Betsy eloped with John in 1772. She was immediately expelled from the Quaker congregation and completely cut off from her family. Undeterred, the young couple opened their own upholstery business in Philadelphia, relying entirely on Betsy's deft needlework and John's business sense to survive. When the Revolutionary War erupted, the cost to Betsy was immediate and devastating. In early 1776, her husband John was killed in a gunpowder explosion while serving on militia duty, leaving Betsy, a 24-year-old widow, responsible for running the business alone. According to the famous legend, it was in June of that same year that three powerful men walked into her small upholstery shop: George Washington, Robert Morris, and her late husband's uncle, George Ross. Now, as the story goes, Washington pulled out a rough pencil sketch of a flag featuring 13 red and white stripes and 13 six-pointed stars, When Washington was asked if she could make it, Betsy supposedly replied, "I do not know, but I will try." She looked at the design and made one crucial edit. She showed Washington how to cut a five-pointed star with a single deft snip of her scissors. Impressed, the men agreed to the change, and Betsy Ross supposedly sewed the very first stars and stripes in her parlor. Now, for over a century, this story has been taught in American classrooms. But the truth is that this story did not surface until 1870, nearly 100 years after the event, when her grandson, William Canby, presented it to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Modern historians point out that there is absolutely no contemporary written evidence, no diaries, no congressional records, no letters from Washington to confirm that this meeting ever even happened. Many scholars actually credit Francis Hopkinson as a signer of the Declaration of Independence with the original design on the flag. But to focus entirely on whether she designed the first flag is to miss the actual remarkable history of Betsy Ross. While the Washington meeting may be a myth, Betsy Ross was undoubtedly vital, highly skilled as a flag maker for the Revolution. Official records show that in 1777, she was paid a large sum by the Pennsylvania State Navy Board for making a ship's colors. She worked tirelessly day and night, running her own business in a war-torn city to supply the Continental forces with the banners they needed to fight the British. Her personal sacrifices continued to mount. She married her second cousin, a sailor named Joseph Ashburn, in 1777. And he was captured by the British Navy and died in a military prison. She married a third time to John Claypool, who had been imprisoned with Joseph, and brought Betsy his final farewells. Betsy Ross did not need to invent the American flag to be an American hero. She represents the untold thousands of colonial women who audaciously endured widowhood, single motherhood, and the harsh economic realities of a brutal war. She kept her business alive, supported the revolution with her own hands, and lived to the age of 84 in the independent nation that she helped stitch together. Now, our story for this next figure begins in 1732 in the lush rolling hills of Westmoreland County, Virginia. The boy we're speaking of was not born to lead an army, was not born to govern a nation. In fact, the strict aristocratic standards of the 18th century Virginia, his prospects were quite modest. He was the son of a planter's second marriage. When his father died suddenly when he was a boy of 11 years old, his older half-brother inherited the vast majority of the family's wealth and grand estate that overlooked the Potomac River. Because of his father's untimely death, the boy's formal education ended early. Unlike the other brilliant minds that would eventually surround him in his life, men who went to Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard, this boy was mostly self-taught. He didn't study high philosophy or ancient political theory. Instead, he studied mathematics, drafting, and the harsh realities of the physical earth. At the age of 15, he took his first job as a surveyor. Armed with a compass and a notebook, he walked into the brutal, untamed wilderness of the Shenandoah Valley. He learned how to survive freezing nights, navigate trackless forests, and rely on absolute, unyielding discipline. These are not the skills of a philosopher. These are the skills of a survivor. At 20 years old, tragedy struck him again. The older half-brother he idolized had died, leaving the young man in control of the family estate. But now he was not content to simply farm tobacco. He wanted to prove himself on a larger stage. So he joined the colonial militia. During the French and Indian War, he quickly gained a reputation not for brilliant tactical maneuvering, but for sheer, unbreakable courage. In one particularly disastrous battle in 1755, the British army that he was riding with was ambushed and slaughtered. The young major rode frantically across the battlefield, trying to rally the terrified troops. 4 musket balls ripped violently through his coat. 2 horses were shot and killed out from under him. Yet he emerged completely unscathed, organized a retreat, and saving the remnants of the army. Word of his miraculous survival spread rapidly. Men began to whisper that he was protected by Providence. By 1759, he had returned home, married a wealthy widow, and settled into the comfortable, prosperous life of a Virginia gentleman. For 15 years, he expanded his estate. He threw lavish parties and served quietly in the Virginia legislature. He had finally achieved the aristocratic life he was denied as a boy. But as the British crown began heavily taxing the colonies and stripping away their rights, this comfortable gentleman grew quietly furious. He was a man who believed in fairness, and he felt deeply exploited. When he arrived at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia in May of 1775, the colonies were in chaos. Blood had already been shed at Lexington and Concord. The delegates knew they needed an army, but more importantly, they needed a leader, someone who possessed the absolute moral gravity to unite the fractured, bickering colonies. They looked around the room and their eyes fell upon the quiet Virginian who had deliberately worn his old military uniform to the Congress. They unanimously elected him commander in chief of the newly formed Continental Army. He took command of the army that was frankly a disaster. They were starving, undisciplined, freezing, and entirely outmatched by the greatest military superpower on the globe. And for 6 grueling years, he waged a war of desperation. He lost more battles than he won. But his true genius was not in winning individual battles, it was in keeping the American idea alive. He refused to let the army dissolve. He endured the agonizing winter at Valley Forge, watching his men leave bloody footprints in the snow. He constantly begged Congress for food, money, and shoes, often dipping into his own vast personal fortune to keep the cause afloat. He sacrificed his comfortable life, not returning to his beloved estates for 6 long years. He commanded not through fear, but through profound personal example. He slept in the cold with his men. He rode in the front lines. Because he refused to break, the army refused to break. And finally, in the autumn of 1781, with the help of the French Navy, he trapped the British army at Yorktown, forcing a massive surrender that effectively won the war. When the war ended, he did something that absolutely shocked the entire world. Throughout human history, when a brilliant general conquered a nation, he inevitably declared himself king, emperor, or dictator. But this man walked into Congress, handed over his sword, formally resigned his military commission, and simply went home to his farm. King George III of England, upon hearing that the general planned to surrender his power and go home, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He wanted nothing more than to live out his days quietly on his estate. But the new nation he had fought so hard to create was falling apart. The Articles of Confederation were weak, the states were fighting, and the country was on the brink of collapse. Once again, his country called on him. In 1787, he reluctantly traveled back to Philadelphia to preside over the Constitutional Convention, using his immense moral authority to keep the delegates from tearing each other apart. When the Constitution was ratified, the nation needed its first chief executive. There was only one man trusted enough to hold that kind of power. He was elected unanimously. The only time in American history that has ever happened. On April 30th, 1789, the 57-year-old man stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. He was dressed in a simple dark brown suit made of American broadcloth, deliberately choosing not to wear the military uniform or royal robes. The streets below were packed with thousands of cheering citizens. As he stepped forward to take the oath of office, observers noted that the savior of the country looked incredibly anxious. He trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the impossible weight of the precedent he was about to set. He placed his hand on the Bible, borrowed at the last minute from a local Masonic lodge. He swore the oath and he stepped inside to deliver his inaugural address. He served 2 terms, setting the foundational precedents for the presidency, and then, true to his nature, he voluntarily walked away from power, again returning back to his beloved farm. He was a surveyor. He was a survivor. He was a reluctant general and a hesitant president. But above all, he was the indispensable man, the only man who possessed the exact combination of courage, restraint, and the character required to forge a nation. We are speaking, of course, of the father of this country, George Washington. Now, as we look back on the incredible sacrifices of men like John Hart, Richard Stockton, Caesar Rodney, women like Betsy Ross, we are reminded that this nation was not built in a state of comfort. It was forged in freezing winters, in prison cells, and in the muddy, exhausting rides through the darkest storms. The people who signed the Declaration did not always agree with each other. They bickered and they debated, and they held wildly different views on what the future should look like. But when the moment came, they pledged their lives to a shared idea, the radical belief that ordinary people are capable of governing themselves. Now, today, as we celebrate the 250th birthday of the United States, it is incredibly easy to get distracted by all the noise on the TV. It's easy to let the fierce political arguments of our current government convince us that the American ship is hopelessly divided. But I want to challenge you today to look beyond that noise. The true strength of this country has never been perfect political agreement. Our strength lies in our ability to continually navigate the storms together. The brilliant neurodivergent innovators who built our technology, the courageous soldiers who fought for our liberty, and the everyday citizens who quietly hold this country together all share the same enduring compass. So today, let's put down the political arguments. As the fireworks light up across the nation, take a moment and look at the flag. Think about the massive, unimaginable cost that was paid by those early patriots so you can stand here freely under it. We are the inheritors of the greatest and most audacious experiment in human history. Let's celebrate the resilience of this complex, beautiful nation. Let's honor the 250-year legacy of those who dared to sail off the edge of the map. Let us move into the next 100 years with the same unwavering courage, knowing that the American journey is far from over. Happy birthday, America. Keep sailing forward. I'll see you guys next week. Please be safe and try to come together in spite of the differences, like we did around here, at least, over the proposed data center. Y'all take care, and I'll see you next week.